and consider becoming a member. Vishavjit Singh found his love for arts at a very young age. He started doodling Sikh characters in his free time, but thanks to his South Asian heritage, was encouraged to leave arts for the sciences in teenage years. Inspired by the creative response of American editorial cartoonists to the tragic events of 9/11 and subsequent waves of hate crimes affecting many Sikhs, Vishavjit started creating cartoons focused on Sikh news and events. As a survivor of 1984's genocidal killings of Sikhs in India, his cartoons focus on the latest political, social, economic, and religious developments within the Sikh community around the world. He creates cartoons on a weekly basis that appear on his website, www.sicktoons.com. His work has been featured in museum exhibits, film festivals, youth retreats, camps, and conferences. You can see his exhibit, Wham! Bam! Wow! at Wing Luke Museum through February 24th, 2019. Sharon Chan is the Director of Journalism Initiatives for the Seattle Times. She has spent her career as a reporter covering Seattle's largest institutions, including Microsoft, City Hall, King County, and the University of Washington. In 2009 and 2010, she served as national president of the Asian American Journalists Association, a nonprofit with 1,700 members and 21 chapters in US and Asia. Sharon also served as vice president of Unity, Journalists for Diversity in 2011 and 2012. And with that, please join me in welcoming Vishavjit Singh.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here, spending an hour of your Monday evening with me. All right, let's see, I've settled the mic down. All right, so it's fair to presume that all of you have seen the invitation to this event, and you've seen me dressed up as Captain America. Now, on a normal day, there might be nothing that extraordinary about seeing somebody dressed up as Captain America, but I know when people see somebody with a turban and beard, there's sort of a clash of sort of initial perceptions about somebody who has a turban and a beard and Captain America. Somehow it breaks the script at some level, and it sort of creates a little bit of an extraordinary moment. I started doing this sort of to confront people's stereotypes about people who look like myself. And I'm sort of have been on a journey since to figure out ways of how do we counter, how do we get beyond labels and stereotypes that we use to define ourselves and each other. And the tool that I've found that really does the job is storytelling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes. I'm going to do my level best to stick to 20 minutes. I can talk for the world. And I'm going to share my story through cartoons because that's how I like to create stories. So let's get started here. That's me on day one. I was born in a hospital in Washington, D.C. I could pass for looking like an old white man here. So from the day you're born, you have a lot of labels that get placed upon you. Gender is one of them. You get a name pretty quickly from your parents. There's another label that we get in the United States, which is very unique to us. It's unfortunately a result of one of the greatest fictions ever told, and that is race. Whether we like it or not, if you're born here and you live here, people are going to perceive you and somehow put race labels on you. And I actually have a race label that when I usually have the option of asking audiences, hey, take a guess, what do you think my race label says? Most people cannot guess what my race label is. So I'm going to show it to you so you know that I'm not actually lying to you. But I'm actually, if you look at that at the bottom left here, my race is white. So in this grand fiction of race, all South Asians are actually considered part of the Caucasian race. And Caucasians are, in the US, we confuse Caucasians for white, that every Caucasian is not necessarily a white person. But the reason I show this to you is, obviously for me, this label does not have much of a consequence. I don't see myself as a white person, other people don't perceive me as a white person. But we know there are other labels that do have consequences. Some people have privilege based on their race label, and some people get killed on a monthly basis because of their race labels and the ensuing consequences. So I spent the first 4 or 5 years of my life in the US, and then my parents happened to be from India. So they moved to India. I got to move with them to India. So I went to private school. And among many other things, when you're a kid, when you're born to a family, you don't get to choose your faith and philosophy, right? You kind of have to do what your parents do, and then slowly over time, you figure out foods you're not going to eat, things you're not going to follow, instructions you're not going to take from your parents, but that takes time. So I got to borrow my parents' faith. One of the youngest religions in the world, Sikhism, has close to 25 million people around the world who follow the faith. And as part of that faith, you keep boys and girls, men and women, we don't cut our hair. We consider it a part of extension of our bodies. And the other reason I like to show this photograph, so this is from first or second grade. You see I'm wearing glasses. I started wearing glasses really young. Glasses today are considered, cool. We get them in a lot of different brands, and people change them all the time. I have 3 pairs myself. Some people wear them, and they don't need to wear them. But when I was a kid, wearing glasses had consequences. I got bullied for wearing glasses. People did not think they looked good on you, geeky, nerdy, and one of the labels that actually was placed upon me by a lot of people, especially people that I knew at home, friends, family, was they started comparing me to my brother, who happened to be a handsome guy, and we knew that handsome boy, I should say, older brother, but they kept reminding me over time that there was something wrong with me, and they started using the label ugly. So by the time I was in high school, so you see me with a longer turban here, I unfortunately accepted that label, that somehow I had aesthetic issues, and that maybe I'm an ugly boy. So I spent the next 25 years of my life overcompensating for that label. So before I move a little forward here, so there's another consequence of labels, that sort of identity that I had to face in the immediate aftermath. So right before I entered my teenage years, there was a really big event that happened in India. Some of you might know it. Most of you might actually not know it. On October 31st, 1984, the Indian Prime Minister at the time, Indira Gandhi, was killed by our 2 bodyguards who happened to be Sikh, turbans and beards. And so what transpired, and there's a long story, complicated political, social, cultural story that I cannot get into right now for reasons of time, but what transpired 4 days afterwards was the powers to be, the state, the Indian government, basically gave sanction to a lot of its citizens to take revenge. And so how do you spot Sikhs? Spot turbans and beards. And for the next 4 days, I'm going to show you this cartoon that has a lot of information on it, but basically what happened is a lot of Sikh men and boys were spotted by their turban and beards, and they were burnt alive. They had kerosene, gasoline poured on them, and lit on fire. A lot of women were violated as well. Houses of worship, homes, schools, anything that Sikhs owned were destroyed in cities across India. And the reason I like to show this, this is one of those interesting times where, so that's one consequence of, this whole notion of labels, identity, but the other thing is controlling narratives. So this incident is known as a riot. It's not known as a act of terrorism or a genocide. So this story still goes on because most people who committed this crime actually got away with it. But the other part that I want to share with you is, and I have never done this in public before, but this was a moment that created enough vulnerability within the Sikh community, within my own self, that for months to come and years to come, there were a lot of more violence incidents on both sides of the political conflict, that there were times when I relished in the news, when I saw people of the demographic majority getting killed, I actually relished in reading that news. And I was ashamed of actually thinking those thoughts, but I never told anybody about it. I didn't tell my parents either. But I knew at that time, I realized that I have the potential in me of having prejudices towards other people, to the extent that I can enjoy and relish in their passing away and them getting killed. I didn't know what to do with that information, but I knew this is not good. But amazingly, people, life went on. The powers to be did not want this to be too much of an event that people commemorate, so people picked up with their lives and went on, and this is mostly a forgotten incident, except a few people who have survived it. There are no sort of state events that happened to remember this. Most people got away with it. And we did the same thing. I got busy with applying to schools, and I decided, okay, I want to come back to the US and do university in the US. And so I moved back after 12th grade to the city of Los Angeles. And how I was greeted by strangers was by calls of raghead, Ginny. People would laugh on my face. So having sort of gone through this whole process of a bullied kid surviving a genocide, I'm like, I was very uncomfortable in my skin. I didn't want to be me. I somehow wanted to figure out a way of sort of just not being me. And so the only thing I could do is, at the time I figured, this is a photograph or illustration of a photograph from my sophomore year at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So I took off my turban, and then eventually I said, I'm going to cut off my hair and see if I can fit it, or at least become a little more invisible. So now what happened is this is California, so a lot of people now mistook me for being Hispanic, which was I'm like, hey, that's good. I'm part of a bigger demographic group now. And it worked. I mean, for a while I realized, people were not staring at me as much anymore, and I felt comfortable. But I realized that I had made this decision not because I wanted to, but because people made me feel that there was something wrong with me. What came to my rescue eventually is I read a lot of books. I was trying to figure out, how do I fit into society? Who am I? What's my identity? And so I read a lot of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. And eventually I fell in love with a beautiful philosophy we all know as Buddhism, which is very accessible through books. Discovered Taoism after that, which is a philosophy out of China. And then late 20s, I kind of fell in love with the faith that I was born into. So for the first time in my life, I decided, I'm going to embrace that faith. En route, though, I went through a bald-headed phase, and I had this mohawk for a few hours, but I did not have the courage to step out with this mohawk in public. So my friends really encouraged me, hey, you know what, this is cool. This is a cool look for you. Go out. I'm like, I don't think so. So I'm like, no, I've had a lot of eyes on me, and no matter how comfortable I'm today, I'm not going to do this in public. So 10 years passed by in that whole phase of me trying to rediscover myself, and this photograph is basically, this illustration is 10 years between the first time I took off my turban and then me donning this turban back again. So the month here, by this time I've moved to the East Coast. I'm living very close to New York City, working very close to New York City. The month is August and the year is 2001. So we all know what happened a month later. So I found out about 9/11 and the attacks initially on Yahoo News on the website at work. And after that, everybody was going to the cafeteria, so we went to the cafeteria. We saw the towers come down. And within minutes of this, I had a coworker who was staring me down with bloodshot eyes and tears in his eyes. And he made me feel very uncomfortable. He was giving me the looks as if I had something to do with 9/11. So I knew our lives were going to be changed, but especially mine, along with many others who looked like me, was going to be transformed in a very big way. So as news was coming in, and we're finding out who perhaps might be behind these attacks, perhaps people whose skin color is like mine, they have a turban, maybe a beard. We went to our boss, me and my brother, who we worked at the same company, and we asked our Polish-American boss, hey, can we perhaps work from home? Because I think things are going to get a little rough for us. And they did. So we did not leave our home for 2 weeks in suburban Connecticut. Only the women in the house would leave. We were fortunate because we had a tech job. We could log in from home. I know many, many Sikhs and others did not have that privilege. And they had to step out and face a lot of people who extended their vulnerability and fear and anxiety onto them. And for those 2 weeks while I was at home, there were so many, and these news items that I was seeing did not make front page news. They were happening a lot all over the US. Anybody who could pass for being Muslim, and this is a very broad group, Arab Jewish, Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, South Asian Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Hispanics, Italians, anybody who had brown skin was fair game. And there were so many incidents of them being discriminated. And these are just some that I've collected that I know of. And so eventually when we stepped out of the house to drive down the highway, This is a 50-minute ride on a parkway. People are driving at 60, 65 miles an hour, and every single car, they took an effort to flip me off, to call us names, to scream at us. Some of them roll down their windows. And these are good people. These are not your average, people you can easily say, oh, these are bigoted, racist people. These are people like you, all of you sitting in this room. All races, didn't matter. People, whatever their vulnerability at the moment, I was vulnerable as well because of these attacks, but they made that decision that I'm going to use my ignorance and my fear, and I'm going to project it onto people who look like, they don't belong here. So it was a very difficult time for me to figure out. And I really felt like I was like in a museum because everybody would stare. Every single person would stare at me. Some with really mean looks, some having, tears in their eyes, and some just, maybe curious looks. But it was a very uncomfortable time. And I know there's many Sikhs at the time who decided, we're going to take off our turbans or we're going to put a hat on top. So for me, these were some of the names that were called and have been called for months and years, and to a certain extent even today, maybe not to that intensity, but these are just some of the names I'm sharing with you that I've been called. That many, it's not just my experience, but it was a very difficult time, and it sort of made me question, wait a minute, what's going on? But one thing I did not question at this point is, look, should I change myself? Because I was pretty comfortable. I had made choices to be who I was. And that's sort of a very difficult thing sometimes to do, but I think that's somehow a lesson we have to learn at a young age. Sometimes we don't learn it till late, is you have to figure out ways of being comfortable in your own skin. And that's what you have to sort of teach yourself and your kids and others. So what came to my rescue was a cartoon by a really awesome political cartoonist named Mark Fury. He lives in the Bay Area. And he created this animated cartoon. So I kind of made a two-dimensional version of it. And he had this cartoon titled Find the Terrorist. It's a fast-rotating animated image. And you had to click on each of these figures to get an introduction to who they are and find out who the terrorist is. And the point that Mark is making here is that people who committed acts of hate after 9/11 were also terrorists. Now, we all know, even today, 17 years after 9/11, we reserve the word terrorist for a certain select sort of demographic folks, right? It's mostly non-whites, it's mostly men, brown men, and that's the power of labels a lot of times, because even if we have somebody who happens to be Caucasian and white and they've done a horrible sort of thing and they've killed a lot of people, we try to sort of give them a benefit of doubt. Mental illness, lonely, right? So this was a profound sort of cartoon for me because I had never seen somebody who looked like me in editorial cartoons, and for that matter, anywhere else in American media, in a positive light. And Mark captured my predicament. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. It took me weeks and months to kind of realize, hey, maybe I should use this tool of cartooning to start telling my story and perhaps share my frustrations with people. So that's what I started doing. And I'm going to share a few cartoons with you here. All right, so we have a little bit of a tech issue here. All right, so while they figure this out, so I started creating cartoons motivated by my own experience, which is unique to editorial cartoonists because I get hustled all the time. And then also sometimes I would look at news items, things that either would tick me off or would inspire me, mostly tick me off because that's how editorial cartooning works. You find contradictions in life. Let me see if I can. All right, so let me do this. I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you some of these cartoons, but let me actually sort of move forward a little bit with my story of how Captain America kind of figures into this whole story. After having done cartoons for 10 years, I went to my first New York City Comic Festival, and I dream in turbans and beards. So a lot of my cartoons are full of turbans and beards. And I had this image one time when the first Captain America movie had come out that, Captain America should have a turban and beard. And Captain America is going to fight hate and bias. Pretty good target, right? So I make a poster, I go to Comic-Con in New York City, and I'm not selling this poster. I'm like, look, I'm just going to use this as a prop so people can maybe come to my booth. And it kind of did the trick. People kind of got confused into why does Captain America have a turban and beard? Why is Captain America Muslim? Thumbs up, weird looks, photographs, and that was good. It sort of got people to start conversations. And there was a pivotal moment that kind of gave me the idea, maybe I'm onto something here. I saw a little young boy, 8, 9 years old, blonde, white kid with his mom, and they were looking at me from the distance, and I smiled at them. They came over, and the mom said to me, out of this entire convention center and everything that my kid has seen today, he loves this poster. Can I buy it from you? And I said, I'm not selling this. I don't have any extras. But I said, you know what? If this little kid, and I really never fathomed that a little kid like that could connect with that image. So I said, you know what? I'll sign this poster and just give it to you. But I realized, you know what? Maybe I've made a connection here with somebody, right? That art can be that powerful. So, all right. So let me retreat back here. So everybody knows this famous painting on the left. And the reason I'm showing you that, the one on the right with the turban is I feel this way a lot of times. I get frustrated when people are mean to me. And I pour my frustrations in my art. I'm a shy guy. I'm an introverted guy. I'm not going to engage you unless, I get a sense that you want to have a conversation with me, I will. But I go home, I'm ticked off, and I'll pour my frustration into my cartoons. Sometimes I'll do figments of imagination. This is a hot air balloon with a bun on top. Like I have a bun on top of my head. This does not exist in real life. But this could, right? You could actually have this. And I'm sure people are going to be asking, why does this hot air balloon have a bun on top? Well, then you can tell them it's a Sikh hot air balloon. So this one is a fictional cover of the New Yorker magazine, and this is inspired by a true life story. Most cities in America today have had policies for the longest time. I cannot serve in police forces in most cities in America. Turban and beards are not allowed. And that's the battle we have to fight. Some cities have started allowing that, but it's a huge battle. A lot of our armed forces will not allow turban and beards. So that's a challenge many of us have. So this is a very interesting piece here. The first city in America to have a mayor with a turban and beard was Charlottesville. When I asked this question of audiences, and before I show this cartoon to them, I asked them, hey, you know what? Take a guess. What state, which city and what state did this first? Everybody's response is California, Washington State, Michigan, Ohio, New York. Nobody talks about the South. And this was Charlottesville. We have our prejudices of geographies as well. People are complicated, geographies are complicated, and I remind people, you know what? You just can't label Virginia and Charlottesville as if everybody who lives there is bigoted and racist. There's a lot of good people there as well, just like there's a lot of people living in Seattle and New York who harbor stereotypes and prejudices, and they act on them at times too. It's just that we tend to think we live in a little bubble, and yeah, I would concede that Seattle has been very welcoming to me. But that doesn't mean we don't have stereotypes and prejudices living in Seattle. We do. Same goes for New York City. This is a question we all get. Where are you from? And I answer that question. I've lived in many different places. I'm born in Washington, D.C. Some people really do not like that answer. They really want to know, no, wait a minute. I know you were born here, but where the heck are you from? And I know over the years what they're trying to get to. Somehow they want to find out that somewhere in my lineage, somebody came from outside of the U.S. So I tell them my parents are from India and they settled down. But I know there are second, third generation Americans who get that question because they don't look American. And again, that those stereotypes and labels we place upon each other. I don't know if you'll ever get rid of this, but we'll see. So most of my cartoons are about turbans and beards and my own experience and people who are similar to me. But there's something which I could not ignore, and I have created some works on the issue of black men, exclusively mostly black men and boys, who get shot and killed on a regular basis. I know I get hustled a lot. I know Sikh men have been killed post 9/11, but I don't get pulled over by cops that much. I don't get guns pulled off on me, and it doesn't happen to most Sikhs. It doesn't happen to most Muslims either. There's something about our experience living in America that African Americans, blacks, there's so much prejudice in our society that they are getting killed in disproportionate numbers. So this was a cartoon I did in response to an NPR piece a few years ago. The city of LA was doing community policing, and as part of that effort, an African-American lawyer, a woman, got access to cops. Private access, no names used. Let's just talk about what works, what doesn't work. And almost every cop, white, black, Hispanic, shared one thing in common, and they expressed it to her, that I fear black people. That's a profound observation. And at some level, I'm not surprised either. But this is a conversation that's happening in private. This is not happening in public. And at some level, a lot of us have those prejudices. I know I grew up in a South Asian household, and the biggest stereotypes that I have to fight within myself are prejudice relating to black people. So I'll share a couple with you, but let me quickly show you another cartoon here. So this is Joe Budden. He's a hip-hop artist who 3 years ago, I believe, at an airport carousel, waiting for his luggage, he spots a Sikh man, my dad's age, dapperly dressed, and he decides to take a photo of him and tweet it with a tagline saying, "Not on my watch, homeboy." He implied that this man is a danger to America and I'm going to save America. And it got a lot of retweets until somebody spotted and realized, wait a minute, this is messed up. Became national news. 48 hours later, Joe Budden apologizes. I don't think it was a sincere apology. He did it because he wanted to save his brand. He was getting a lot of negative publicity. But the reason I show this cartoon is to remind people we all have prejudices, even black people, even brown people, even myself, even Sikhs. We have a lot of prejudices towards each other, within our own groups, towards others, and towards white people as well. And we need to self-reflect a lot of times, because it's very easy to look at somebody else and say, oh, I don't do this, somebody else does it. All right, so before I get into the Captain America story, I want to share a couple of because I know I've talked a lot about how I've been hustled. So I'll share a couple of items with you, how I have my prejudices with black people, and I have to wrestle with that on a daily basis. So I live in Harlem, in New York City. All of you have heard of Harlem, I can presume. Everybody has their own image and stereotype of Harlem. Predominantly black, a lot of black history, perhaps predominantly poor, violence-prone, drugs, things like that. I have those stereotypes. I had those stereotypes. So when me and my wife were looking for a place to buy, she happens to be British, so she has very different eyes with which she looks at people. I told my wife, look, I don't want to live in Harlem. And I told her my reasons. So we went to another borough. We went to Brooklyn. And eventually, sometimes as life works out, we found a great place in Harlem and we could afford it, so we're like, let's buy it. And I've been living there for 5 years. I've met a lot of amazing people, African Americans, a lot of them. And I've overcome my own stereotypes. But despite that, even today, I'll catch myself a lot of times stereotyping black people. So last year, I'm in Washington, D.C., taking a train up to New York at an Amtrak station, and I spot a black man walk past me, track pants, T-shirt, and he has a newspaper under his arm, and I could see it's the Wall Street Journal. And the first thought that came into my head is, why is a black man dressed like this reading the Wall Street Journal? I would not have had that thought if I saw a white man, perhaps a South Asian man. But I thought that because I have stereotypes about black people. We all do, because they're part of our DNA in America. And it's going to take a long time for us to extricate them. And one of the most important things we can do is we have to self-reflect on our own prejudices before we start pointing fingers at other people. And I know we're living at a time where there's so much happening, so many videos happening, and it's very easy to say, racist, racist, racist. I'm not one of those people. And I would like to contend that actually one thing we have more in common with each other is our prejudices towards each other. All right, so the Captain America story, as I mentioned earlier to you, so this was a poster that I had created. This is a poster that 9-10-year-old little boy loved, and I gave it to him. And there was a photographer in passing who mentioned to me, you know what, Vishavjit, this is kind of cool. Maybe you should come back and dress up as Captain America next year. And I said to her, I don't think so. I was very emphatic. She didn't ask me why. I knew my reasons. I have body image issues all my life. I've been teased. I've been bullied all my life. It's post 9/11. I mean, people stare at me. People call me names. They tell me to go back home. Why would I want to wear a skin-tight leotard uniform and step out and get every single pair of eye on me? That just would be crazy. So it took her a year to convince me to do that. And there was a Seattle connection to this. There was a tragedy that happened in August 2012 in Milwaukee when a white supremacist walked into a Sikh house of worship, Gurdwara, temple, and killed people, 6 people, without saying a single word. And in response to that story, I wrote an op-ed that we need a new comic superhero in America who's going to be not white, who's going to be Jewish or black or Sikh or Hispanic, and he's going to fight hate. So I actually sent it to a lot of publications, and Seattle Times actually published it. And so I didn't know at the time, and Sharon had to remind this to me. Even today, in most newsrooms in America, we don't have a lot of representation when it comes to opinion editors. So Sharon decided to publish this piece, and I got a lot of pushback online from a lot of readers, but I got a lot of love as well. So Fiona, this photographer who had mentioned to me, hey, you should dress up as Captain America, read this piece and said, emailed me saying, would you please reconsider? And I did, hesitatingly. And the first thing I did is, she got me a uniform from Hong Kong because she could not find my size in the US. It was a teenager size. Ships it to me. I go to Sports Authority and I buy football and baseball pads to shove them in my uniform because I wanted to look big. My wife looked at me and she goes, you look like cartoons that you draw? Please don't do this. If you're gonna do this, you will do this as Vishavjit Singh, a skinny guy, comfortable in your skin, with your own issues and vulnerabilities, and step out that way. It took a few weeks. It happened. So I'm gonna show you a few photographs. That's me in Central Park. And I was really scared because I really thought people were gonna be offended. And something really magical happened. That's me coming out of the subway. We did not plan on that A matching up. That's me jumping in and out of a fire truck. Now, we spotted a fire truck, and Fiona asked the fire officials, can we have your truck? On a normal day, any one of you can step out and do this. And I ask audiences all the time, even little kids and adults, if you saw a fire truck and you asked for that fire truck, would you get it? And they all say, of course not. They're not going to give it to you. But I had a privilege that day, which I didn't realize until this moment. Well, actually, I did realize that day. They gave me their truck for 20 minutes. They left the truck. There were 4 fire department officials. They left their truck. They trusted me in that uniform. And I pretended I was driving that truck. I jumped in and out of it. And that was my privilege for that day. I got pulled into weddings. I was hugged by hundreds of people, photographed, followed by people. And my life has not been the same since. These photographs went viral. I've been on late night comedy shows. I've been invited to schools and companies and film festivals. I mostly go by invitation to events, but sometimes I will go involuntarily as well. I went to the RNC convention, Cleveland 2016. I stood in front of the convention center so everybody passing by will get to see me. That was a really surreal experience. I only got hustled by a couple of people, and I think we'll get into that maybe later on, perhaps in my conversation with Sharon. I went to the Women's March in Washington, D.C., and that was an amazing experience. I want to show you one more photograph here because I want to come back to the issue of labels and stereotypes. So this little boy you see up there, he's a middle schooler probably. He saw me for 10 minutes, and quietly. And then he goes to me after 10 minutes, what are you doing? I said, I'm Captain America for the day. He goes, no, you're not. I said, why not? He goes to me, you're not white. So I'm thinking in my head, technically, I am, but I'm not going to have this conversation with this little kid. Because he, I just don't have a birth certificate to show it to him. So I'm like, okay. But I said to him, look, dude, this Captain America is fictional. He was created in 1941. We're in the 21st century. Captain America can be a woman, Hispanic, black. He could look like me. So he thought for a moment. He goes, black, yes. Hispanic, maybe. Turban beards, no. And you know what? This kid was not being mean. I saw this kid, and he was right in front of me, and he was a gentle kid. I mean, I really had a sense that, he's just being honest. He just could not fathom seeing a Captain America who looked like me, because he probably had never seen somebody like me in person, and certainly not in a positive light. So I said to him, that's okay, I'm not offended, but for the rest of your life, you're going to have this image inside your head of me as Captain America, which you will never be able to voluntarily delete. And so next time you see somebody who looks like me, perhaps the image of Captain America is going to come up, and it's going to confuse you. And that's why I do art. I didn't know this. I didn't used to use this word. I like to confuse people. It's a good thing to confuse people. Create art,
tell your stories so we can confuse each other when it comes to the stereotypes we apply to each other. Because each one of you is a unique story, an amazing story. And once you look beyond, what you see on the outside, you'll find a lot of things that we have in common. And I know we always don't have time to hear each other's story and tell stories, but we're gonna have to figure out a way. If we wanna get rid of these labels that we use on a daily basis to demean ourselves, at some level, we are taking our own dignity away by using these labels, and sometimes taking other people's dignity away by using these labels. We're gonna have to figure out ways of telling stories. And one of the biggest sort of steps we're gonna have to take is when you tell your stories, you're gonna have to be honest with yourself, because you can't just be telling stories, hey, I'm awesome, this is what happened to me, right? You're gonna have to talk about your vulnerabilities. You have to self-reflect and say, yeah, I've gone through some difficult times, or I've had thoughts about being prejudiced toward other people. Maybe I have committed acts of prejudice towards other people. Unless we can have that conversation with ourselves and others in public, we're gonna live with these labels. Black people are gonna keep dying, and a whole lot of other things are gonna happen. And that's our challenge today. In this age we live in, where it's very easy for powers to keep putting us in boxes, and for us to keep saying, I'm not a racist, somebody else is a racist. I say, you know what, we need to step out, use our vulnerabilities, and say, you know what, actually, I do have a lot in common with some of these people who are committing acts of hate and bias. And let that be a starting point. And then, we go from there. So I think this is a good sort of segue at this point for me and Sharon to start a conversation. So we'll do that, and then we'll open up to question and answers. And I'm going to leave this, actually. Thank you.
I think you're going to need to grab your microphone from over there.
Yep.
So thank you so much for that, for sharing your art and your story and telling your story with us. I think what a lot of people don't know is back in October 2012, when you submitted that guest column, and at the time I was a guest columns editor at the Seattle Times, you were not a full-time artist. No. You were working, tell us what you were doing then.
So I've been a software engineer for 15 years until about 2.5 years ago. I left my job 2.5 years ago, and I'm not a full-time artist, and thanks to my wife for paying most of the bills.
So tell me what gave you the courage to change your life?
Mostly tragedies, unfortunately. I don't see myself as a courageous person. It's just sometimes when you have tragedies happen, you can do two things. Either you can retract in your just sort of put a shell around you and say, look, I don't want to deal with this, or sometimes you go out on a limb with the assistance of not only that tragedy, but people around you who kind of nudge you and say, look, maybe step out and try something new. And that's kind of what happened for me. 9/11 and the Milwaukee massacre were moments where I took certain steps that I didn't realize that I had that sort of courage, if you may, to try on new things.
You talked a little bit about how Fiona had to convince you to beg and plead with you to put on this Captain America costume, and then she sent it to you, you put it on. Tell me, take us through what it was like to step out into the street in that outfit the first time.
I felt naked, scared, sweaty palms, and I think I remember the first moment when somebody spotted me. It was a tourist, and they asked me for directions. So I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And then it was like people started gathering around. They took photos, and then we didn't plan on this, but the biggest cultural day parade was happening in the city, in New York City. It was Puerto Rican Day Parade. So we ran into the parade, and so that was a really surreal experience, because people are like, wait a minute, Captain Puerto Rico, Captain America, Captain Puerto Rico. So that happened. And then, I ran into some cops who came up and said, can I take a photo with you or off you? And New York, I don't know about Seattle cops, but New York City cops, they don't smile at you usually, and they certainly don't tap you when I look like this and say, you're a handsome chap, can I take a photo of you? But with that uniform, they got confused into saying, look, my son loves Captain America, can I take a photo of you? So so it was like a twilight zone where so I was out for 9 hours, and it was just like, I'm like, wow, there's something weird going on here, that people totally see me with fresh eyes.
I think this is a really interesting point you bring up, both about police officers and you interacting with people who would never interact with you otherwise, going to the Republican National Convention and going and interacting with people who, you presume may not be welcoming of someone like you. And I think this is just in these polarizing political times, something we all deal with when we're on Facebook and someone kind of a friend pops up in your comments and just totally disagrees with your position on whatever, Brett Kavanaugh or the homeless payroll tax. So what's your advice to people on how to engage and cross that bridge with people who disagree with what may be foundational beliefs?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I mean, I don't engage in a lot of those conversations with people because I sort of use my art a lot of times to engage people through my art. So sometimes having those conversations is hard because it's like you're saying your point and they're saying their point. And it's like, look, I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you. I think one of the strategies that I use is obviously humor and sarcasm at times, but I think I just find, I remind people a lot of times, you might have issues with certain people you think are not American. Just go learn your own story, learn your story of your ancestors. And I find a lot of people today who are pointing fingers at other people saying, you don't belong here. More than half of them have stories of people in their past who came here illegally, who came here to perhaps make a better life for themselves. They didn't have legal papers and, they worked hard and, here you are a few generations later. I think most Americans don't know their own history very well, and I think we would do much better if we sort of learned more about where we have come from. Yeah, and I'm not seeing that happen today. I think people are just like, they've set their minds, look, there's a certain group that belongs here and there's a certain group that doesn't belong here. But I would, I know it might not be the best answer because not all of us are artists, but I just feel educating. So one of the things that I did after 2016 election is I've been educating myself about American history. I'm reading a lot about how have we come here in the last 200-300 years. And I've learned a lot. There's a lot of contradictions in America. There's a lot of amazing things. America might be great, but America's full of contradictions. There's a lot of dark sort of chapters in American history, and I think we all need to read those chapters. Little kids need to read them, young kids need to read them, and adults need to read them.
What if one of your messages right there was about learning your own story, right? What if I don't like my story?
So that's a question that I sometimes get asked by little kids. Little kids ask me the most profound questions, usually elementary school kids. And I tell them, if you don't like your story, that's okay. You can change your story. But the critical thing is, don't change your story because somebody else is telling you your story. Either I don't like your story. You change your story because you want to become a better version of yourself. And it's something that's hard to do because sometimes you're hearing a lot of messages from people, oh, you're not normal, you don't fit in. And so sometimes you get convinced, and I know I did. So would a 10-year-old version of me get convinced? I don't know, but maybe if somebody had come and shared their story with me with all its honesty and vulnerability, maybe I would have said, you know what, yeah, maybe I have a story and I can, I want to share my story. But I think, yeah, it's critical. And I see a lot of kids who would come up to me later on and saying, hey, one of the comments they say a lot is, thanks for your honesty. Thank you for sharing your vulnerability, because a lot of adults, including our teachers and sometimes our parents, they don't share their vulnerabilities with us.
Well, I want to get to your guys' questions out here and leave time for that. So I guess I'll just, my last question to you is really what's next for you?
So I am working on my first graphic novel. It's an autobiographical graphic novel, and I'm going to be sharing my story of born in the US, growing up in India, surviving a genocide, 9/11, a whole lot of other interesting things. So hopefully by next year I'll have it published. I have an editor right now, and I'll come back to Seattle and share my graphic novel.
So if you have any questions, you can go to the mic here or mic here. Anyone?
While you guys are getting queued up, I will ask Vishavjit another question. Well, let's talk about, you just mentioned vulnerability, right? And every time, when you're creating your art, when you are even just telling the story about it again, you're reliving painful moments of people flipping you off or calling you names or screaming at you driving down the highway. How do you get comfortable with that vulnerability?
I mean, I don't know how it started happening, but I know when I first started getting invitations from a lot of schools after my Captain America gig, and I was asking myself, okay, how do I connect with these kids? So I started sharing my story through cartoons, and I found that they would connect with some of the through lines where I was sharing my challenges of getting bullied as a young boy. And that kind of was my cue. Look, I need to basically be very honest and share that. And that's the one part, where they were really responding. And that kind of gave me the cue, I need to be honest with myself and start sharing some of these stories in public. And it works amazingly well. I mean, I'm able to see a pretty good response from a lot of these kids who are able to not only come and have conversations with me, but a lot of times, I do cartoon workshops after my talks. And a lot of times kids, they get pretty personal with their art. And they talk about mental health issues, body image issues, race issues. And to me, that's an affirmation, that sharing, if I'm able to share my vulnerability and that gets them to open up, you know what, yeah, that's there's something special there.
I hope you have a question. You're not sneaking out.
No, I have a question. Thank you, first of all, for sharing your story. I wanted to ask a follow-up question about part of the story. So when you felt like you had to leave your office after 9/11, when you came back, was there any sort of reconciliation or resolution? I mean, did those coworkers recognize that they were the reason why you felt like you couldn't come back? Something like follow-up for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the couple of people who gave me those looks were people I did not work with. They were in the same company. It was a small office, but when I came back, I was still trying to figure out, it was a very sort of difficult, challenging moment at the time, so I didn't feel comfortable, obviously, approaching that person. They did not approach me, but a lot of the co-workers, at my work were they realized what we were going through, so, but yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have that conversation, that reconciliation with those people who were actually giving me those looks. And it took me a long time. There were people even out on the streets who would sort of extend their prejudices towards me. I did not know how to respond to them. It took me months sort of, and really, for me, I found cartooning as a way to engage people. Now, many years down the line, sometimes if people call me names, I'll assess the situation, and if I feel like, they're not gonna get physical, I will engage them. And I will say, okay, wait a minute, do you really think, I'm Osama bin Laden, or do you really think I'm a terrorist? And sometimes, they'll say, look, I didn't mean to say it. And I'm like, well, no, you did mean to say it. It's just you didn't think that I was going to come and, engage in conversation with you. So, yeah, I mean, it took a long time for me to figure out a way of connecting with people, even those, who are hustling me.
We have another question.
Thank you so much for coming. I have twin transgender sons that are 7, and they love superheroes, and so I'm very excited to tell them that I saw Captain America tonight. They're very excited about that. I did have a question for you. When you were talking about anybody can be Captain America, have you ever thought about doing a photo shoot where you had some of the other people that you mentioned dressed up as Captain America with you and have like a whole group of Captain Americas that don't look like what people expect?
So thank you, first of all, and thanks for that question. I have sometimes when I've gone to comic festivals, I've run into other versions of Captain Americas. African Americans, women, kids. We've taken photos together, but I will take that idea back to New York, and maybe I will find a group of other Captain Americas, transgender, women, grandmothers, little babies, and I think that would be an awesome photo shoot. So I'll take that note, and maybe one day, you'll get to see that. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that idea.
I think you should bring that idea back here. As a photographer, but it's good to see your presentation. I got to meet you last time, but was out of town for the presentation. My question is, who are artists, illustrators, cartoonists who you look toward for inspiration, perhaps, in your storytelling?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a few. When I started editorial cartooning, there were people like Jules Pfeiffer, Ed Sorel, Paul Conrad. These are, some big names. Some of them are retired. Some of them have, they're not illustrating much anymore. And then contemporary illustrators like Mark Fury and Telnace from Washington Post. I mean, I was consuming a lot of their work not to learn how to draw, but really how to think like an editorial cartoonist, because cartooning and a lot of art is not really just about sketching, but it's really about capturing, analyzing contradictions, and pouring them on paper. So yeah, I was a student of a lot of these cartoonists for months and years to sort of, educate myself about how to find those through lines and, put them on paper. Yeah. Thanks
thank
for
you.
that question.
I think, any other questions before we wrap up? I mean, I think I will just also say something, which is that I've personally been really inspired by your story. I became a journalist in order to amplify underrepresented voices. Oh, great. We have one more and
Hello, how are
one
you?
more question over here, so I'll pass it over to you.
We have a librarian here from Kent, so holler to all the librarians, and hey, Carla.
Well, what do you think of, it seems like a fundamental confusion between Muslims and Sikhs. What do you think of, I mean, it's ignorance, of course. It's confusion, it's ignorance. What would you think of a program that has people, like Sikh people and Muslims, talking about their religions or their differences? Do you think that would help at all with this problem?
So thanks for that question, and thanks for coming here from for attending this event. My approach to that is a little different here. Sometimes people criticize me from within the Sikh community, saying, hey, when you give your presentations, why are you not talking more about Sikhs and introducing them, where they come from? And I have to remind them, look, there's a lot of other really qualified people who are doing that. I'm here, and I understand that I might be representing a certain community when I do this. My goal is I want to tell my story so people realize that there's a lot more to me than being besides just being a Sikh. Yes, that's a big part of my story, but there's a lot that happens. There's a lot of diversity within Sikhs too. I want people to know, look, I have a unique story. All of you have a unique story. And yes, there's Muslims out there too. There's more than 1 billion Muslims. And there's a very diverse group here, right? I want to live in a world where we can respect each other's differences and enjoy each other's stories, as opposed to living in a world where everybody knows who Sikhs are and even who Muslims are, but when times get rough, they're going to take these factual decisions to say, okay, we're not going to harass Sikhs because we know who they are. We'll harass Muslims. We'll target our bigotry better, right? So that's the world I don't want to live in. But yes, I think it does help to have an education system that educates us about all the diversity, the different faiths and backgrounds. That does work. But I really genuinely feel, if we taught our kids to share their stories in brutal honesty, we will start looking beyond a lot of times, yeah, it's true somebody is Sikh and Muslim, but then we'll find out, there's so much more to them that we will have a hard time defining them by using one or two labels. Hi.
Hi. I'd like to learn more about some of the encounters you had at the Republican National Convention. So, like, what occurred that you expected, and what might have surprised you?
A great question. So I went there on the invitation of a cartoonist who is a widow of a really famous cartoonist who has now passed away. And so she had this idea, let me just gather a bunch of cartoonists from all over the US and let's go to the convention and we'll have some interesting interaction and we'll create cartoons out of it. So I'm thinking, sure, why not? Let's go. And she really insisted that I should join the group. So I did, and I was thinking, should I really take my uniform or not? And then I decided, sure, why not? I'll take my uniform. And so it turned out every other cartoonist was like talking to people, creating cartoons. I said, you know what? I'm just going to don my uniform, have some banners with me. So sometimes I'll carry banners with me. I won't have my shield. For me, so I'll have banners like, so the one banner that I took to Cleveland was, let's kick some intolerant ass with compassion. So it's a little provocative, but it's got compassion in there as well, right? So I thought I was going to get hustled, that it was, it might be a little rough, but conventions are like carnivals. They're performance art shows.
And there was a lot of misogyny as well, by the way, especially towards Hillary Clinton, which really bothered the heck out of me. But what I did is, so I'm expecting to get hustled a little bit, but what I noticed is a lot of people got confused, and certainly they thought, well, this is kind of cool and interesting. So I got photographed a lot with, just by myself, with people. The only two people who stereotyped me and said something negative, one was an Arab guy who called me Osama bin Laden, and the second guy was a European guy. So he initially comes over, starts talking, so I realized he's got an accent, so I asked him, wait a minute, are you American? He's like, no, I'm not. He was basically telling me, you cannot don this uniform, you cannot do this, and he was really upset, and I'm like, okay, wait a minute, hold on a minute, you don't know my story, you're not an American, I'm an American, and you're telling me I cannot don this uniform. So he walked away, he was ticked off. But besides that, I got a lot of police officers from Texas, from Ohio, and other places. They're like, oh, my son loves Captain America. Can I take a photo of you? So yeah, it was, I mostly got embraced. I think I'm probably on a lot of phones as a photograph all over the US, and people are probably sometimes saying mean things or misrepresenting me, but at least they're seeing me in my turban and beard with Captain America uniform. That should be enough to sort of confuse them for years to come, and that's a good thing.
And what did you do when the Arab guy called you Osama bin Laden?
I said to him, so we were having a conversation with other cartoonists. I'm like, wait a minute. So he was complaining actually about the candidate at the time, Donald Trump. And I said, so wait a minute, you're complaining about Donald Trump and how your people are prejudiced, how your people are targeted. He was from Jordan, Arabs and Muslims. And I'm like, you just stereotyped me? Don't you see the contradiction? And he kind of laughed it off. But that's the problem with human beings. We're complicated. And we have our prejudices all over the place. And usually when we have a race and bias conversation, I will ask people a lot of times, so I'll ask people, like, look, if you've heard my story now, who do you think hustles me the most? And most people will say, white people. Because that's our stereotype. Anytime we want to talk about race, of course, white people have to be the ones who are perpetrating, hate or bias. My experience, and a lot of people I know who are Sikh, my family members and friends, and I'll say this to you, there's two demographics that hustle me the most in my face. In person. I get a lot of other hustling too, but in person, there's two demographic groups that get in my face. Blacks and Hispanics. They're the ones who are coming up and telling me, go back home, Osama bin Laden, you don't belong here. So again, that's counterintuitive, right? And like I said again, it's narratives, as people are complicated, and we need to really do a better job of sort of asking ourselves, look, you know what? Life's a lot more gray. There's a lot more complications here. So yes, Hi.
Hi. So originally, superheroes were like Superman and Captain America were created by Jewish men to sort of be a hero for them and to portray their views in a comic. And with something that was originally so much that was not prejudiced and was about spreading the values of a marginalized group. How do you think that has become a vehicle for hate? And a follow-up question, have you thought about creating your own original Sikh character to accomplish the same purposes?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first. I mean, maybe at some point, yeah, I will perhaps create a new character, but I feel like right now Captain America is opening a lot of doors for me. It's opening a lot of conversations. So as long as Captain America has sort of that power, I'm going to keep wielding that power. So your first question, I sort of want to, I'm not sure if I understand that. So I know so there's a very interesting fact that you shared, which a lot of people don't realize. A lot of American superheroes were created by Jewish Americans or Jewish immigrants.
That's right.
Who either themselves or their families were escaping the Holocaust. So it's a very sort of interesting sort of anthropological story behind there, and they ended up creating a lot of superheroes. But I'm trying to understand, you're asking, I want to sort of understand that question a little better here. You're saying, so those characters were created to battle hate, but how
how do you think that over time they have become a vehicle for people's hatred? If they,
People's hatred, you mean?
people's prejudices when
I'm-
they were originally intended to oppose people's prejudices?
Yeah, I mean, I still see most of the sort of superheroes as people using them to. I mean, it depends on your perspective, right? I'm sure somebody probably says, "Oh, Captain America is my." I have seen actually. So this is interesting. I've seen a lot of extreme right white supremacists who actually use Captain America symbols and uniform to say this is our guy. And I'm obviously using it from a very different perspective. So I think it really depends on your perspective. I mean, my perspective is that most people see superheroes, Superman, Batman, a lot of the other superheroes as superheroes, that are still fighting for the good cause and they're fighting hate. But yes, I'm realizing also that a lot of people are now saying, hey, or some people are saying, those are our superheroes. They are American and they're going to fight illegal immigration or whatever else. That's their perspective, and I think we need to, like I said, keep sort of. I'll have to take your idea as well. Maybe create a new. Marvel has done a pretty good job. They have a new Miss Marvel who is a Pakistani American teenager from New Jersey. So I think we are seeing changes happening. We are seeing new characters are coming out, and hopefully we'll see many more that can hopefully drown out some of those other bigoted narratives.
We do one more over here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's segued into what I was asking. Wanted to ask if you have any contact with cartoonists and humorists like Ted Rall, Tom Tomorrow, Steve Bell, and of course Sacha Baron Cohen. Because they're all working in a similar
Yeah,
vein,
so I've
but
actually-
they're not. Except for Sacha Baron Cohen, who's Jewish, they're not, and I don't know about the others,
So I have met Ted. I've met actually some of them because I have attended some of the American Editorial Cartoonists Association gatherings, so I'm aware of their work. They're aware of my work. Yeah, I mean, I certainly have met them, and I follow their work, and some of them, do really cutting edge, hard-hitting commentary on America today. Which certainly I've consumed their work in the beginning years as well to sort of teach myself how to think about cartooning. So yeah, in some ways, they have influenced my work as well.
And the second thing was just this morning, there was a discussion on, I don't know if it was on the Amy Goodman or the Morning Blend on KBCS, about all the various episodes of ethnic hatred and deportations, the Chinese in the 19th century, and then why it became necessary to allow Mexicans to replace those that were kicked out. But the one thing that wasn't mentioned was the rage and the hatred of Japanese Americans, after Pearl Harbor. And, so we have a whole history of marginalizing people. I mean, we started with, and it's still going on, with Native Americans. So it's somehow part and parcel of the American character and psyche to pick on vulnerable people. And we have a president, unfortunately, who is the worst possible example of that. And it's terribly cowardly, that's all,
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think that's when I earlier said we would be a little better off, probably more than a little better off, if we learn our own history, right? And there's a lot of dark chapters to it. There's a lot of good chapters as well, where people have overcome some of that bigotry. But unfortunately, it is true that every generation we have the new other, right? Every generation we define some group as, okay, you don't belong here. We've had Jewish, obviously African American, the natives have their own, unfortunate history. But yeah, we keep going through that cycles of, we're going to have now today, it's many different groups, right? It's not only Hispanics. We're living at an interesting time where I get the sense that a lot of groups from LGBTQ to Jewish and Muslim and Sikh and Hispanic, we're all feeling like, we're getting this heat that, you don't belong here. And I think this is a moment, where we can take an opportunity and say, look, maybe, we need to figure out ways of how we can collectively use our stories from the past and present to somehow change the narrative. And we all have to become obviously more active in civic and political affairs as well, and we are seeing that already. People are running for elections, but I think I go back to saying we need to educate ourselves. Our education system doesn't do a great job at times, sometimes, of teaching our little kids, and as you grow up, and even in university, of our own history. All the dark part of it and all the great part of it, all the wonderful parts. And I think if we did that, it might be not comfortable reading it, but I think we would be better off.
Yeah, and particularly
Thanks.
the legacy of slavery, which is the undercurrent for almost everything.
Thank you for
which we haven't
that.
come to terms with.
Jonathan, do you want one last one over here?
Hi. I live next to a Sikh temple, and I was just wondering, I've been curious about it. I was wondering how to approach it, or what would you have advice for, like, a person like me going in and experiencing?
If you were to go in, that's your question, how would you sort of go into the temple? Or
Yeah.
So a lot of, so I don't know which area this is, but I think Sikh houses of worship, gurdwaras we call them, they're obviously very welcoming to anybody who wants to come in. So you can certainly walk in and introduce yourself and say, hey, I'm a neighbor and I'm interested in, learning about Sikh culture, and you would most likely be taken first to the community kitchen to be fed, because that's something we do a lot in our homes and gurdwaras. Hopefully, if you find somebody who, is from here, born here, raised here, or somebody who has a good command of the English language, they'll probably walk you through and explain to you how we worship and why we worship and what our values are. But you would get a really welcome response. You might have more than a few eyes on you because people are going to be like, wow, okay, we have a new visitor here. But it's, I think I would encourage you to go in and just say, hey, I'm a neighbor and I want to learn more about Sikhs. Yeah.
Thank you.
Vishavjit, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you. Thank you,
Pass it over to
Jonathan.
Jonathan to wrap us up.
Thank you for coming, and more events every day, pretty much. You can get calendars out in the membership hall. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.